The Apple Watch Series 10 is the Apple Watch most people will likely get if they plan to get an Apple Watch right now. But is it the best Apple Watch to get in 2025? Well, in terms of features and usability, it's one of the most solid and well-integrated devices out there. But if you want to track your workouts and your health, is the Apple Watch the way to go? That's what we'll test in this video. Now, as you likely know, the Apple Watch Series 10 was released in 2024, which felt like a year of incremental upgrades to me in general. For instance, the Oura Ring 4 right here, which was highly anticipated, isn't all that different from the Oura Ring 3. The Garmin Fenix 8 released in 2024, which isn't all that different from the Fenix 7 Pro and Epix 2 Pro. And the new Galaxy Watch, the Galaxy Watch 7, is not different at all in my opinion from many of the previous generation Galaxy Watches. And honestly, Apple in general also does this a lot. Many upgrades, maybe 90% of the time for the same product line, feel like incremental upgrades, and the Apple Watch Series 10 is no exception. There was quite some hype about a potential new design given that this was the 10th watch in the series. However, all we got was a slightly larger screen and slightly thinner design. Now don't get me wrong, those are all still very nice things, but those alone wouldn't be worth the upgrade for me. What I care about most is tracking my workouts and measuring my health metrics. So is the Apple Watch Series 10 up to the task? Now, as always, we will test this systematically as we do with all watches so we can compare it as fairly as possible between them. Now, I have to be honest, my testing also isn't perfect, but it's the best I can do at the moment, and I believe it's at least on par with the best reviews out there. And this video does have one special element, and that's the fact that I didn't just test the Apple Watch Series 10 on myself, but I also tested it on my friend and very happy colleague Raphael. Now, Raphael actually enjoyed using the Apple Watch Series 10 so much that he's now considering getting an Apple Watch himself. But who cares about those subjective opinions? What we want is hard data. So let's take a look at the results. And since Rafa was so happy with the Apple Watch, let's start with his data. Now, I do have to mention I only tested the 46mm version in this final test because I think that's the one most of you will likely get, but I have no indication so far that there's any difference in performance between the 46 and 42mm versions. Let's first look at the results for running outside, and as always we'll use the Polar H10 ECG chest strap as a reference. A chest strap is generally the most reliable way to measure your heart rate, and the Polar H10 has been used and validated in quite a few scientific studies, which is why I use it. And this plot right here shows you an overview of 3 runs that Raphael did, with the Polar H10 along the horizontal axis and on the vertical axis the Apple Watch Series 10. And if the measurements would perfectly agree, all values should be on this blue line right here. So each dot is a matching measurement between the Polar H10 and Apple Watch Series 10. And as you can see, luckily almost all points are on or close to the blue line. There's a few measurements that are away from it, maybe 1, 2, 3, maybe 5 at most. But overall, this looks almost perfect, and that's also why this R value up here is 1.00. So the correlation that R value cannot be higher than 1, and 1.00 is basically the best value you can get. But still, let's take a look at the individual runs to see if we can explain why they're still a few points away from it. But honestly, we just expect a very good result. Here we have the first run that Raphael did, with along the horizontal axis the clock time and Raphael's heart rate along the vertical axis. In blue-green is the heart rate according to the Polar H10 ECG chest strap, and in red the heart rate according to the Apple Watch Series 10. And as you can see, we basically have a perfect agreement between the Apple Watch Series 10 and the Polar H10. Maybe near the end here, the Polar H10 has a few more extreme values, but overall this would be by far good enough for me. Now this second run also looks basically perfect, only right here is there a bit of deviation. And also for this last run where I did intervals, we see a really good match between the Apple Watch Series 10 and the reference device. So overall, I basically have nothing to complain about. But running can sometimes be hard and sometimes easy. Often cycling outside is harder. But before looking at that, let's see how these results compare to the results of other watches. And indeed, we can provide some context by comparing the results of the Apple Watch Series 10 to the results of different watches that Raphael tested before. Now, he only tested a few watches, but it gives you some impression of what watches come close. And again, we want the correlation, which is along the horizontal axis, to be as close to 1 as possible. And as you can see, the Apple Watch Series 10 is performing about the same as the Pixel Watch 3. So they would be at the very end if there was really a perfect correlation, but rounded they are at 1.00. So looking quite good. You can see that the older generation Pixel Watch, the Pixel Watch 2, did significantly worse than the Pixel Watch 3. And we knew that was a significant upgrade. And also the Whoop strap is not bad at all, but definitely worse than the Apple Watch Series 10. And we can also see that the Whoop strap recently got upgraded because the old version of the heart rate tracking algorithm wasn't as good, but their newer version is a lot better. I think all these devices here, so the Pixel Watch 2, Pixel Watch 3, Apple Watch Series 10 and Whoop strap would be good enough for Raphael. But let's take a look at some more difficult exercises. So that looks really good for the Apple Watch Series 10, honestly. I'm quite satisfied so far. But let's challenge it a bit more and let's see how I did on Raphael for a total of 22 bike rides. But first, if you're finding these videos interesting, it really helps me get access to new devices sooner and helps me reach many more people if you like this video and subscribe to the channel. Pressing those two buttons really makes a huge difference, and commenting of course also helps. I would really appreciate it. But back to the testing. So here's a similar overview to what we had for running, but now for biking outside. And as you can see, the results are a tiny bit worse. So the correlation is now 0.99, so not 1.00 rounded. And you can definitely see a bit more deviation from the blue line, but it's very minimal, honestly. So generally looking quite good, but let's again take a look at those individual bike rides to see if we can see any artifacts. Here we have one example bike ride with again the Apple Watch Series 10 in red and the reference in blue-green, where we have more or less a perfect agreement. So there's some minor deviations, so right here in the beginning, but also right here the dip was partially missed, but overall this would be good enough for me. Also this second bike ride looks more or less perfect, but here there's a tiny bit of deviation. Here the Apple Watch actually lost signal for a little bit. Also right here, a really good agreement. Also here, a really good agreement. I would say we generally see a very good agreement. Just some of the minor details are a bit different. So sometimes the reference device has more abrupt changes in heart rate, and those are not always fully detected. But overall, this would be good enough for me. Also right here, a tiny bit of deviation. Just sometimes for a moment, there appears to be a loss of signal, for instance, right here, but also right here. Generally though, nothing major to complain about. And just for completeness, let's quickly put these results in the context of a few other devices again, where again we see that the Apple Watch and the Pixel Watch 3 are the best performers, followed by the Pixel Watch 2, then the Whoop strap, and finally the Galaxy Fit 3. So really Pixel Watches and Apple Watches are doing quite well. The Whoop strap is probably good enough, though definitely has a lot more issues than the Apple Watch. That's still looking very good. Only some of the fine details were lost, but otherwise this is really good of the Apple Watch Series 10. For both outdoor cycling and running, the Series 10 has an amazing performance. To close off, let's take a look at the results for weightlifting on Raphael. And here we have the overview for weightlifting, where surprisingly most points are on or close to the blue line. There's a few dots quite far away from it, which is why the correlation isn't super high at 0.94. These few points right here can have quite a major impact on the correlation. But overall, this looks a lot better than what it normally looks like for me. For me, normally either there's a lot of missing data or there's a big cloud of points here below the blue line. Now, Raphael could still have missing data as well, but we need to take a look at the individual sessions for that. So let's take a look. Here we have the first example weightlifting session, which honestly looks really good, a lot better than what it normally looks like for me. Again, the reference device in blue-green and the Apple Watch Series 10 in red. And the Apple Watch generally follows along with all the peaks in Raphael's heart rate. Only right here one was missed, but overall this is definitely good enough. This second weightlifting session also looks really good, a bit of deviation here in the beginning, but most of the peaks in heart rate are correctly detected. Also, this third session really looks good. I don't see any major problems, mostly good agreement. And also this final session looks really good. So I'm not really sure what's going on here. What normally happens on my body, at least when I wear the Apple Watch, is the moment I do a set of exercises, there's a lot of tension on my wrist, and the Apple Watch just cannot detect these peaks in my heart rate. It is aware of the fact that it cannot detect these peaks, so it just stops detecting my heart rate, so it doesn't detect a wrong heart rate like many watches do, but it just fails to detect the heart rate. I'm not sure about the Apple Watch Series 10 yet, we'll see that in a moment, but I'm really surprised how good these results are for Raphael. When I saw these results, I was honestly really surprised, since on me, Apple Watches tend to really struggle a lot during weightlifting. Usually in the peaks of my heart rate, it just stops detecting my heart rate because there's so much tension on my arm, but for Raphael this appears to be less of a problem. I don't know if the way that Raphael does exercises is different, maybe it's unique to our physiologies, or maybe the Series 10 is actually performing better during weightlifting compared to previous generations. We'll see if the latter is the case by looking at the heart rate tracking performance on me for the Series 10. However, let's start with one of the easiest exercises for a smartwatch to track on me, indoor cycling. But before doing that, I have a question for you. Do you like these videos? Do you want to get early access to the results? And do you want to support me in making these videos? Then please consider becoming a YouTube member. I recently came to the conclusion that I just cannot keep going like this, since I also have a full full-time job as a postdoctoral researcher, and I was running this channel all by myself. I've now hired an editor to help me out with some of these videos, but that's not cheap. So if you want to financially support me to keep doing that and get some perks at the same time, then please check out the link up here or down here. Thanks for considering, and back to the video. And looking at the results for indoor cycling on me, we again see good agreement between the reference device and the Apple Watch Series 10. The correlation rounded at least is again 1.00, so almost perfect. That's just a few points away from the blue line. There's a tiny bit of deviation. Let's quickly check if there's any missing data and also what causes these few points to be away from the blue line. Here we have the first example interval spinning session where I would say we have an almost perfect agreement between the Apple Watch in red and the reference in blue-green. Only here was there a tiny bit of deviation, but really nothing to complain about, I would say. This session right here also looks really good, no missing data. This session as well, here I also see no major issues. And also right here, no major issues. Though in this section of the training right here, there was a bit of missing data. So you see this straight line right here. That means for a while the Apple Watch wasn't able to detect my heart rate. So overall, nothing really big, but this is a first hint that sometimes the Apple Watch might start to struggle, especially for harder exercises. But let's first put these results into the context of other devices. And you can see the performance of the Apple Watch Series 10 in red right here compared to many other devices I tested in the past. So again, the correlation is the value we use for this, so that's R value. And on the vertical axis, I ordered the watches from worst to best. So the further to the right and the higher a device is, the better is its correlation with the chest strap. And as you can see, the Apple Watch Series 10 is amongst the best devices by far. But let's zoom in a bit so we can read those labels better. And you can see that zoomed in view right here. So these are just the watches with a correlation of 0.9 or higher. And as you can see, even amongst these devices, the Apple Watch Series 10 is amongst the top 5 performers. And all the top 5 performers are Apple Watches. There's basically no significant difference between them. So we have the Apple Watch Series 6, Series 8, Series 9, Series 10, even Series 7. The only one that's sprinkled in between is the Pixel Watch 3 right here. So this is similar to what we saw for Raphael. Again, the Pixel Watch 3 and the Apple Watches are the best performers out there. You can even get some relatively cheap Huawei devices like the Huawei Watch Fit 2, which is already a decent heart rate tracker. But Apple Watches are still a bit better than these Huawei devices. Though of course you need an iPhone for an Apple Watch, and for a Huawei device you can use either Android or iPhone. So it's a bit more versatile. So even the Apple Watch Series 6, which you can probably get quite cheap now, has similar performance to the Apple Watch Series 10. So really question what Apple Watch you want to get in this case. Again, that's pretty amazing performance for indoor cycling. However, during outdoor running, we actually see some first small issues for the Apple Watch Series 10. And looking at the results for running right here, we definitely see a slightly lower correlation at 0.97. And we also see some points away from the blue line now. So right here in the higher heart rate range, sometimes it detects a too high heart rate. Also right here, a few times it detected a too high heart rate. So it isn't perfect, and I'm a bit afraid that there might be some cadence lock going on. But we really need to take a look at the individual runs to see if that's an issue. And for this first example run, we definitely see some issues. Again, the reference is in blue-green, but the Apple Watch doesn't perfectly follow along. So for instance, right here, I had a dip in my heart rate, and the Apple Watch just kept detecting an increase and then lost signal for a while. So this straight line right here means it lost signal for a little bit. Also right here detected a too high heart rate. Right here in the beginning a too low heart rate. So I'm not really sure what's going on here. It also seems to have lost signal here for a little bit. So it could be mostly due to signal loss. But here I definitely still thought it had signal. It detected a too high heart rate. So I expect in those moments there might be some form of cadence lock going on, where the frequency at which I was running was very similar to my heart rate, and that interference then causes it to detect a too high heart rate. Interestingly though, this second run is basically perfect, so it could be that the watch was not positioned perfectly right here, where it had a better position on the wrist right here. I tried to be very consistent, but who knows what happens. Also, this run right here basically looks perfect with a bit of deviation here in the beginning. This fourth and final example run I wanted to show you looks good here near the end, but here in the beginning the Apple Watch also struggled for a little bit. So I'm not sure if maybe my wrist was still warming up here since it's quite cold at the moment in Vienna. But these indicate some first initial issues of the Apple Watch Series 10. I'm not really sure why it's having these issues or what's going on right here, but it's a first indication that it's not absolutely perfect. And again, we can put these results into the context of some of the other devices I tested in the past. You can see that in this overview right here, where again we want the devices to be as far to the top right as possible. And here we see that the Apple Watch is not amongst the absolute best performers. Interestingly, the Apple Watch Series 8 and 9 seem to have done a little bit better on me than the Series 10 potentially. I'm not sure if this difference is significant. Also, I tested it maybe under different circumstances when it was a bit warmer out, which does increase the blood flow to my wrist, so there could be some interference of the cold weather here. Still, it is among some of the better performance, so nothing really to complain about, honestly. Again, the Pixel watches are doing really well. They're actually not in this overview, but the Pixel Watch 3 did really well for running. Even the Pixel Watch 2 isn't bad at all. And we can see in general that previous generation Apple Watches, especially the lighter ones, so the 8 and 9, did very well. The Ultra had a bit more issues, probably because of the increased weight, but still pretty decent. And also the Amazfit T-Rex 3 that I recently tested did really well. So still a good performance from the Apple Watch, just some minor issues. So yes, there are some small heart rate tracking issues for the Apple Watch Series 10 during outdoor running, but they're honestly quite minor. Or what do you think? And one thing I wanted to show you before I forget, I also did an indoor run with the Apple Watch Series 10, just a single one, so I didn't want to focus on it too much. But as you can see, it did quite well. It had some minor deviations right here in the beginning. Also here in the very beginning, it lost the signal for a little bit. But overall for indoor running here, it seems to do quite well. Though as we saw before for outdoor running, even for something like that, it sometimes has a good session, sometimes a bad session. So based on this one session, I don't want to draw too big of a conclusion. But what about outdoor cycling? This is generally even harder for most devices out there. Will the Apple Watch Series 10 start to fail here? Let's take a look. Well, just looking at the overview right here, it doesn't seem at first glance that the Apple Watch Series 10 had any problems detecting my heart rate cycling outside. Correlation is really good at 0.99 and most points are on or close to the blue line. Yes, there is a bit more deviation than we saw, for instance, for cycling indoors, but overall still looking very good. Though as you will see in individual sessions now, the Apple Watch is starting to have some problems. And looking at the individual bike rides, for most sessions we mostly see decent agreement, though we already see some first signs of missing data. So for instance right here it stopped detecting my heart rate for a bit. Also right here it's having some small issues. Now for this bike ride I don't think it's a major problem, but I'll show you some examples where it's a bigger problem. This bike ride right here is a good example. So in the beginning of this session, twice for about a minute or so, it completely lost my heart rate signal. So right here and right here. This is not looking that good. There's also some deviation right here and right here. This second example is even worse, where here for a while it stopped detecting my heart rate. Also right here, here, and here you see some straight lines, all indicating loss of signal. And this example bike ride is one of the worst I had, where there's a lot of loss of signal, but also some deviations from the true heart rate. Now these are the exceptions rather than the rule, so these are the worst examples I showed you right now. But this is the first time I've experienced some issues with my Apple Watch that were this severe. But now it's really the middle of winter with relatively low temperatures, which could influence the blood flow to my wrist, which might influence the quality of the heart rate signal that the Apple Watch can pick up on. But this is just a hypothesis. And again, I have to say many bike rides look a lot better, like this one right here, for instance. Also this one right here, this one right here. Also this one doesn't look terrible, though there is some loss of signal right here. Also this one doesn't look bad. And this one right here, which was a much longer bike ride, also looks quite good. So I was showing you some of the worst examples, but I am a bit surprised. I'm not really used to this from Apple. And again, we can put these results into context using the correlation, which is this R value along the horizontal axis, and the Apple Watch Series 10 is marked in red right here. And as you can see, based on just the correlation, it's doing really well. It's among some of the top performers, so basically all the other Apple Watches and the Pixel Watch 3. However, it doesn't take into account that missing data. So it's good that the Apple Watch realizes when it's not having a good signal, so it just throws out most of those values. But this overview is a bit deceptive in that sense that it doesn't take that into account. But zooming in, we can see that based on the values that the Apple Watch Series 10 was able to get and had a reliable measurement for those measurements, the Apple Watch Series 10 is performing about the same as, for instance, the Apple Watch Series 9, Series 8, etc. So there doesn't appear to be any significant difference in performance between the devices when it does have its measurements. And I cannot imagine that the Apple Watch Series 10 is actually worse than the Series 8 or 9. My suspicion is it's either the specific unit I have that's having some issues or the outside temperatures having some effect on it. I think no matter what recent Apple Watch you get similar performance. So the correlation is still really good for outdoor cycling, but we do now see some minor cracks in the Apple Watch's performance. There were a few moments where I detected a mostly too low heart rate, and there were some moments where I just lost the signal. On the one hand, it's actually good that the Apple Watch realizes when the signal quality is not good enough and it just yanks away those measurements. However, in an ideal world, it would be able to measure my heart rate under all circumstances. Still, I have to admit, these are relatively small complaints, and compared to basically all of the competition out there, except for maybe the Pixel Watch 3, the Apple Watch is still the best wrist-based heart rate tracker out there. But to close off this section, I still owe you those results for the performance of the Apple Watch during weightlifting. So let's take a look. Now for weightlifting, the results look surprisingly good for the Apple Watch Series 10. Normally I see more of a deviation, but the correlation looks really good at 0.99. Now again, this doesn't take into account missing values, which could still be there, but this looks surprisingly similar to what we saw for Raphael. So I'm really keen now to see how the individual sessions look. This first example session looks surprisingly good. The values according to the reference device and those according to the Apple Watch match basically perfectly, and most if not all of the peaks in my heart rate were detected, so here it looks really good. This second session though doesn't look quite as good. You can see that there was a loss of signal for most of the peaks here in the beginning, so here the Apple Watch really struggled. This session right here is sort of a mixed bag. In the beginning here, the Apple Watch was mostly able to detect the peaks in my heart rate. Near the end it struggled, and this session right here again isn't very good. Many of the peaks in my heart rate are missed, and this final session I want to share with you again is a mixed bag. Some of the peaks are detected, some aren't. So it's somehow a bit better than I expected, though Apple has been slightly improving this, potentially at least, but it's still not good enough to reliably detect all those peaks in heart rate. What you know is that the heart rate that was detected is most likely reliable, but it will just have a lot of missing data in there. And again, we can put these results into the context of many of the other devices I tested in the past. And in this case, the Apple Watch Series 10 has the highest correlation out of any device I've ever tested. So that's looking really good. If we zoom in, we can see it's basically performing about the same as the previous generation Apple Watch, so the Apple Watch Series 9. But it's close enough to all the other Apple Watches as well. So the Apple Watch Series 6, 7, 8, the SE 2022, and also the generation 1 and 2 of the Apple Watch Ultra. So I would say, at least based on correlation, no matter what Apple Watch you get similar heart rate tracking performance during weightlifting, which still isn't reliable enough to capture every peak in your heart rate during weightlifting. So if you care about heart rate tracking during weightlifting, as I always say, just get yourself an ECG chest strap. That way you know you will capture most of those peaks. So overall, in general, that looks pretty amazing for the Apple Watch Series 10. But let's combine all of these results in a single plot to get an even better overview. And here you can see that overview for all of the different exercises we were looking at before. So spinning, biking, running indoors, running outdoors, and weightlifting. Where along the vertical axis, again, we have that correlation value. So each dot in this plot is a different device that I tested. And the results for the Apple Watch Series 10 are marked by a red dot and a red line. And both the correlation and the percentile is spelled out. So the percentile actually indicates what percentage of the watches actually did worse in the Apple Watch Series 10. Looking at spinning, for instance, we can see it had a basically perfect correlation, and only 4% of devices did better, and 96% of the devices had a worse correlation than the Apple Watch Series 10. Also for biking, it has a really good correlation, and it does better than 95% of the watches. For indoor running, we only had that one run, but based on that one run, it's the best device out there. For outdoor running, the correlation was a bit lower at 0.97, but it's still better than 86% of devices out there. And also for weightlifting, it's the best device out there based on correlation, with a correlation of 0.99 at the 100th percentile. So overall, looking really good for the Apple Watch Series 10. But as I mentioned before, I don't know if you actually need to get the Apple Watch Series 10. Maybe the 9, 8, 7, or 6 is even good enough for you. So let's take a look at those results. So looking at the Apple Watch Series 9, for instance, we basically get the same performance for all of the different exercises I tested it for. So I think there's no significant difference between the Series 10 and Series 9. Also for the Series 8 already a super good performance. For the Series 7, I would say similar story. I didn't test it for as many sports, but it's always among some of the better performers. And even the Series 6, this was already true. Now, I would need to retest the Series 6 because this is a quite old result. But the fact that the correlations for the Series 6 and Series 10 are more or less identical and the sensors still look the same, and I don't think there have been really any changes, makes me think at least that you basically get the same performance for the Series 6, 7, 8, 9 or 10. So if you want to save some money and you just care about the health tracking, just think about which device you can get cheaply. Talking about cheaper devices, the Apple Watch SE 2022 2, which does have a different sensor, so a slightly lower performing sensor, theoretically at least, still has a really good performance in practice. So that's also an Apple Watch you can get for a decent price, and that's one I would recommend to many people as well. Just save yourself some money and don't get the latest and greatest if that's not needed for you. Of course, there's nothing against getting the latest and greatest, but if you want to save some money, this is an option. Now, of course, there's also more expensive Apple Watches, so the Apple Watch Ultra Generation 1 and Generation 2, and these generally tend to perform the same as the Apple Watch Series 10. However, because of their increased weight, for instance, for running, they sometimes show some more issues. And also for biking, sometimes they can show some minor issues. But I think it's mostly for running where I see a difference in performance. So overall summary, Apple Watches are great heart rate trackers, but there's not really any significant difference between the different generations and different kinds. Overall, as I said before, really good heart rate tracking performance, as we've honestly come to expect from Apple, with some minor issues here and there, but nothing major. But what about this sleep stage tracking performance? Can the Apple Watch do that? That test seems to be something many of you have been waiting for, at least based on the comments I've been getting. However, I do need to put one big asterisk on my testing here, and that's the fact that I've been having some issues with my reference device. I use the Z-Max EEG device, but for several weeks, maybe even months already, this has been giving me some minor issues, and recently I've had really bad quality data for many nights. So even though I tested the Apple Watch for many nights, for most nights I ended up just having too bad data quality and throwing out the reference data. In the end, I only had 3 nights where I mostly trust the reference device. Still, even though I tried to select just those nights where the raw data looked really good, there's still a chance that the performance of the Apple Watch will appear to be slightly worse just because the reference device has some issues, similar to my results for the Oura Ring 4 for last week, for instance. For future testing, I'm now using a new unit of the same device, but for now, this is the data I have to work with. So with that out of the way, let's take a look at those results. Here I show an overview of the sleep test results for a total of 3 nights. That's the tested sleep stage tracking performance. As I mentioned before, I compared the Apple Watch Series 10 against the Z-Max EEG headband, which can actually measure my brain waves. Now, this device also has its limitations, especially when it comes to detecting awake time, but it will give us a general impression of the sleep stage tracking performance of the Apple Watch Series 10. Though, as I also said, because the performance of the Z-Max might be slightly compromised, the percentages might be slightly lower than they're actually in reality. Now, on top are the sleep stages as recorded by the Z-Max EEG device, and on the left are the sleep stages as recorded by the Apple Watch Series 10. Now, each column here sums to 100%, meaning that we can see what percentage of each of the sleep stages according to the Z-Max was predicted as the sleep stage by the Apple Watch Series 10. And if they perfectly agree, all values on the diagonal here should be 100%. Now, first of all, we see that about 62% of what was deep sleep according to the Z-Max was also predicted as deep sleep by the Apple Watch Series 10, which is pretty okay. Most Z-Max identified deep sleep that was predicted differently by the Apple Watch Series 10 was predicted as light sleep instead. Now, light sleep agreement is actually very good at about 86%, and most confusion in this case was with deep sleep. REM sleep agreement is also pretty good at about 72%, with most confusion in this case being with light sleep. And I don't want to focus on awake time because the Z-Max tends to detect a lot of these short awake moments that aren't really awake moments, so you always get a way too low percentage here. But just for completeness, about 29% of what the Z-Max said was awake time was also awake time according to the Apple Watch Series 10. So overall, this actually looks very good. The deep sleep agreement could be a bit higher, but we're also only working with 3 nights of data. So with more data, potentially also that percentage would go up because there must be some random variation in this data. But let's take a look at some of the individual nights to see what's exactly going on here. And indeed, looking at the individual night will help us understand that even better. And here we see the first night I wanted to share with you. On top, we have the sleep stages according to the Z-Max EEG headband, with along the horizontal axis the clock time and my sleep stages on the vertical axis. And on the bottom, we have a similar plot, but now for the Apple Watch Series 10. And as you can see, there's quite a decent agreement. First, looking at deep sleep, which is marked in purple right here, you can see I had 1, 2, 3 main deep sleep segments, and all of these were also detected by the Apple Watch Series 10. Though interestingly right here, that first segment was quite a bit shorter, but overall a quite decent agreement. Also looking at this second night, we see quite decent agreement. So I had 2 main deep sleep segments, and both of these were also detected by the Apple Watch Series 10. Also a few shorter ones right here. This is not what it typically looks like for me, but interestingly the Apple Watch Series 10 agrees with these as well. And REM sleep agreement, which is marked in red right here, is also very good. So the REM sleep detected by the EEG device is marked in red in both of these plots. And as you can see, the REM sleep as detected by the Series 10 basically agrees almost perfectly. Only right here do we see a bit of a shift in the exact location. And also here near the end, where I was likely going in between being awake and in REM sleep, The Apple Watch Series 10 just detected light sleep and awake time, but overall most agrees very well. And also for this other example night where I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 main REM sleep segments, all of these were also detected by the Apple Watch Series 10. So overall, quite a good performance. And again, we can put these results for the Apple Watch Series 10 into the perspective of many of the other devices I tested in the past. And this graph right here shows you an overview of the agreement of different devices with different EEG references. Along the horizontal axis, we have the average agreement over the individual sleep stages. And on the vertical axis, we have the agreement of the worst sleep stage. So the better the agreement, the more to the top right the device is. Now this overview is slightly complicated because you use different reference devices. The devices not marked in any color were tested against the Dream 2 EEG headband, but I cannot use it at the moment. The devices marked in blue-purple were tested against polysomnography, which is the gold standard in sleep stage tracking. And the devices marked in green were tested against the Z-Max EEG headband, the one we used in this video. And you can see the results for the Apple Watch Series 10 right here. And as you can see, it's quite far to the top right, though not quite as far as, for instance, the Apple Watch Series 9, the Apple Watch Ultra, the Series 7, Series 8. So it seems to be slightly, but just ever so slightly underperforming compared to these. However, again, I should say I only had 3 nights of data, and also we have that issue with my reference device. So also in other recent testing, we saw that the Oura Ring 4 is doing slightly worse than the Oura Ring 3, the Pixel Watch 3 is doing slightly worse than the Pixel Watch 2, and the H-Sleep Pod 4 is doing slightly worse than the H-Sleep Pod 3. So all of this indicates to me that I had a slight issue with my reference device, and that most likely all these newer generation devices are doing about the same as the generation before them. So that also goes for the Apple Watch Series 10, which likely performs similar to the Apple Watch Series 9, 8, 7, etc. So in general, Apple devices are among some of the best sleep trackers out there, together with the Oura Ring, the H-Sleep Pod 3 and 4, and also the Nukoa or Sleep 2 app. And in the second tier of devices, which are still pretty good, are for instance different Fitbit and Google devices. And you can get some Fitbit devices already quite cheaply. So that can be a relatively budget-friendly way of getting decent sleep stage tracking. And also the Withings Sleep Analyzer and the Whoop Strap are doing quite a good job. So these are also in the second tier of devices. So these first tier devices and second tier devices are the only ones I would use for sleep stage tracking. Now the Whoop Strap, for instance, is one of those devices that is not amazing at any particular thing, but is quite decent at everything. So the Whoop Strap is an all-round good device, but it's worse than the Apple Watch in sleep stage tracking, also in heart rate tracking, but it's better than the Apple Watch in presenting your data and helping you interpret it. So it's a better all-round app experience, but the actual raw data is slightly worse than the Apple Watch. And of course, the battery life of the Whoop Strap is better. So in my experience so far, the type of people that like Apple Watches and are thinking about buying it also like the Whoop Strap. So you have to decide what is more important for you, the app experience and the better health interpretation of the data, or better raw data and also having a watch which actually has a screen, etc. But overall, to conclude, I still think that the Apple Watch Series 10 is a good sleep stage tracker, just like all the other Apple Watches. So at first glance, just looking at that graph without context, the performance of the Apple Watch Series 10 appears to be slightly worse than previous generations. However, as I mentioned before, I think this is due to an issue with my reference device, not an issue with the Apple Watch. Based on the results I showed you today and the results I recently had with other devices, I'm pretty confident that the performance of the Series 10 is the same as that of the other recent Apple Watches, so Series 9, 8, 7, 6, etc. So I expect that no matter what Apple Watch you get roughly this same sleep stage tracking performance. This also means that if you already own an older Apple Watch or you decide to get an older version which is a lot cheaper, you probably get similar sleep stage tracking performance. And we can actually interpret this as a good thing, because that means if you have an older Apple Watch, you still get good performance and you don't need to spend extra money to upgrade. Now this makes sense in a way because Apple already has a really good algorithm, so why change it? But on the other hand, this adds to my feeling that each new Apple Watch is just really an incremental upgrade at best. Still, getting back to the positive, if you have a relatively recent Apple Watch, you know you'll most likely have a quite reliable sleep stage tracker. But let's move on to the next test. Many of you will likely also want to track your ride or your run and want to make sure that the GPS tracking performance is good so that you get a good accurate distance estimate of your route. I tested the GPS tracking performance 9 times cycling to work and 10 times cycling back from work, and I cycled roughly the same route each time. The idea here is that if the GPS tracking is very good, it should track the same route each time no matter when I cycled it. Or maybe a better way of phrasing it, if the GPS tracking routes are not consistent, it's very likely that the GPS tracking is no good. And here you can see the 9 times I cycled to work And I always started my route on the corner right here. And as you can see, most of these green markers are super close to that corner, meaning that the signal was acquired almost instantly and also relatively accurately. Only one time did it take a little bit of time right here, but only a tiny bit. So the signal is acquired quickly, so that's already good. Next, let's see if the signals are consistent. So zooming out a bit, we can see that a bit better. So here we can see a bit of deviation. This particular signal doesn't look very good. So that's the one actually that took a little bit of time for the signal to be acquired. The other ones already look very good. So here I actually took 2 different routes. Let's go a bit further. Here the signals are quite consistent, not perfectly so, but quite okay. Here there's actually a bit of deviation. One of the signals deviates quite a bit. Then here it also looks okay, not perfect, but pretty good. There is some spread of the signals. Here it actually looks really good. Here it sort of splits up into 2 parts. Not sure what's going on there. Here it keeps being split up into 2 parts. Maybe the calibration of the signal was off for a while, or at least a bit different, so that there was a systematic difference between these 2 sets of times that I tested it. Still overall looking pretty good. There is a bit of deviation, but generally pretty consistent. Here they're all a bit spread out, but still roughly on the road. I mean, this is not perfect, but it's pretty good. There's definitely a lot of worse devices out there. This sort of tells me it's in the 2nd tier of devices, not the absolute best. But let's confirm this by looking at the 10 times I cycled back from work. So here you can see the results for 10 times I cycled back from work, and I always started my ride right here, so near this area right here. There's a bit of deviation for some of the signals. This is actually where I took off. This is not a deviation. But then from here on out, the route is the same. Again, this indicates that the signal is acquired quite quickly, though sometimes there's some deviation on where the actual first marker is placed. But it seems that they converge quite quickly to roughly the same spot. So there is some deviation right here. Overall looking pretty good, not amazing, but pretty good. And again, the signals get split up into several parts here, 2 or 3. So there is some systematic deviation where some signals are consistent between themselves, but different from some of the other sets of signals. Not sure why that is. Generally looking pretty okay, not amazing, with some deviation from the road right here. I mean, overall it's not bad, but there is some spread in the signal, more than I would like to see. Here it's looking pretty good, here it's looking pretty good again, and here I actually took some different routes, so let's go down a bit further. Here near the radio tower, sometimes there's some spread. For these signals it looks quite good, so here there's a bit more deviation. Again, this is not bad, but it's also not perfect. I would think this is good enough for me, but there are some better devices out there. It's definitely not amongst the bad devices. There are just a few sports watches that would likely give you slightly better performance, so it's up to you to decide if this is good enough. I mean, that's not an amazing performance in terms of GPS tracking, but still pretty good. My feeling is that this is sort of 2nd tier performance in terms of GPS tracking. Something like a Garmin would likely do better, and it would be 1st tier, but this kind of performance of the Apple Watch would likely be good enough for many of you, at least is my expectation. But please let us know in the comments below what you think about the Apple Watch Series 10 and the GPS tracking performance. Oh, and there's one feature we didn't talk about yet, the fall detection of the Apple Watch. You all know I do everything I can to make these tests as in-depth as possible. So on a recent bike ride, I decided very intentionally to fall over and see if the alarm would go off. So let's see if it did. Now I know what you're thinking, Rob, that almost seemed like a real fall, and it almost seemed like it was a real accident where you broke your derailleur hanger and you were stuck on the top of a mountain and you had to call your friend Francesco to pick you up in his van since you were stuck in the cold. And to that I say, well, thank you, I'm just such a great actor. But regardless, as you saw, well, mostly heard, the fall detection actually worked. And don't worry, it didn't call the emergency services. Since I moved immediately after my fake fall, I had some time to dismiss that message. So now that you've seen my amazing acting skills, what is my overall conclusion on the Apple Watch Series 10? Well, in terms of health and sports tracking, it's amongst the best watches out there, potentially actually the best watch overall. So if you don't own an Apple Watch yet and you use an iPhone, the Apple Watch Series 10 is a very solid choice. However, would I upgrade? Well, likely not. Even my old Apple Watch Series 6 performs more or less the same as my Apple Watch Series 10. Yes, there are some new features, but those are relatively minor, at least to me. In general, it's actually super nice that many new features also come to older Apple Watches, meaning that there's less reason to upgrade actually, because the older models are still very good. Now there's also downsides to Apple Watches. One thing is that Apple still hasn't developed a very good app that helps you summarize and interpret your health data. They did make a first attempt now and recently released the Apple Vitals app, which is sort of a bare bones version of what I hoped this would be, but compared to competitors like Whoop and Aura, Apple is still lagging behind quite a bit. There are third-party apps like Athletic and Bevel, but it would be nice if this kind of thing was natively supported. And yes, for those of you that have been asking, I promise to test these apps somewhere in 2025. So the Apple Watch is a great choice, but it has its limitations, and if you want to get a good deal, it might be worth looking into the Series 9 for instance, which is very similar to the Series 10 and has similar tracking performance. If on the other hand you don't mind paying full price, you want to have the latest and greatest and probably get an extra year of updates, the Series 10 is a really good choice. Now if you want to get sneak previews on future results, consider becoming a YouTube member, and if you do decide to get an Apple Watch Series 10, a Whoop strap, an Aura ring, an HD Pod 4, another device, or anything at all on Amazon for that matter, even something as small as toilet paper, want to support the channel and save some money, there are different affiliate links in the description below and some provide a discount. Now given that you watched this whole video on the Apple Watch Series 10, I think you might like this video on why the Apple Watch is such a good sleep tracker, or this video on why the Whoop strap is one of my top recommendations for overall sports and health tracking. Thank you so much for watching and catch you in the next video.